It is the morning of July 6, 1535, Tower Hill, London. A man in a grey robe stands at the scaffold. His name is Thomas More. He has come to die, not for a crime, but for his silence. Around him, a crowd is gathered. Some are hostile, some are weeping. The king he once called friend has ordered him dead. As More prepares to kneel, he makes a joke to the executioner about his beard, a small gesture of grace in the face of the axe. But before we understand how a man of conscience and wit ended up here, we have to ask the question that will frame everything we learn today. Who betrayed whom? Was it the king who turned on his oldest friend? Or was it More, who, by refusing to bend, broke a vow to serve? The answer to that question will reshape how we understand loyalty, law, and what it costs to stay true. Welcome to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, the podcast where we look what is behind well-known stories and myths. I'm your host, and this is the story of Thomas More, humanist, lawyer, saint, and a betrayal so profound it split a kingdom and cost a man his head. Today's episode asks a deceptively simple question. In the clash between conscience and contract, who is the traitor? The king who rewrites the law to destroy a former friend, or the man who refuses to sign away his soul? Here's what we'll investigate. More and Henry VIII began as intellectual partners, bound by genuine affection and shared passion for theology and learning. Yet, within 20 years, they became mortal enemies. We'll trace the exact moment their trust fractured. We'll examine the trial that was rigged before it began. We'll uncover how the king weaponized the law against his own conscience. And we'll reveal why the only evidence that could convict More was testimony everyone knew was a lie. By the end, we'll understand how More's refusal to betray his beliefs exposed the deepest betrayal of all, a king's betrayal of law itself. Let's set the scene. Early Tudor England. The year is approximately 1515. King Henry VIII is 24 years old, intellectually restless, theologically curious, and completely secure in his power. He has been king for just 6 years, but his grip on England is absolute. And it is around this time that Thomas More enters his inner circle. More is older. He's in his late 30s, but he is not a nobleman. He is the son of a judge, educated at Oxford, trained as a lawyer. What he brings to Henry's court is not birth or military cunning. He brings mind. Razor-sharp classical learning, fluency in languages, theological sophistication. According to Desiderius Erasmus, the great humanist scholar who knew both men, More and Henry became inseparable. Erasmus wrote in a letter to Ulrich von Hutten, dated July 23, 1519, that Henry was so fond of More's company that the king would never rest until he dragged him into his court. Erasmus noted that More could debate theology and philosophy with a sharpness that matched the king's own intellect, and that no one was ever more ambitious of being admitted into a court than he was anxious to escape it. But this was more than intellectual sparring. It was genuine affection. The king did something unprecedented. He began visiting More's private home in London unannounced. According to William Roper, More's son-in-law and first biographer, Henry would arrive at More's house, sometimes without warning, and the two would walk together in More's garden, talking for hours. More later told Roper something that reveals the true nature of this friendship. If the price of a castle in France was my head, it should not fail to go. What does this mean? More was saying, if the king demanded my own life as the cost of keeping a castle in France, I would have to give it. In other words, a servant to a king cannot refuse. Loyalty is absolute and unconditional. Even then, More understood what proximity to a king actually meant and the danger that came with it. But before that friendship with Henry could deepen in the 1510s, there's an important story to understand, one that foreshadowed everything to come. It happened in 1504. More was 26 years old and newly elected to Parliament. King Henry VII, the current king at the time, Henry VIII's father, demanded a massive tax from Parliament to fund his daughter Margaret's marriage to the King of Scotland. To understand the scale, Henry VII was demanding what was called a 3/15 tax. In medieval England, taxes were measured by fractions of movable property. 3/15 meant the king was asking for the equivalent of 1/5 of all movable wealth in the kingdom. In 1500, a single 15th yielded about £37,930. 3/15 would have extracted over £113,000 from an already financially strained kingdom. Every member of Parliament was terrified to oppose the king, but More stood up. According to parliamentary records, More gave a speech in the House of Commons that persuaded the members to offer the king a fixed sum instead, just £30,000. This was a dramatic reduction. Rather than extract a percentage-based tax that could take far more from the kingdom, Parliament negotiated a flat payment. One of Henry VII's chamberlains reported back to the furious king that he had been thwarted by a beardless boy. Henry VII was enraged. He could not punish More directly. Parliament had some protections, so he arrested More's father and threw him in the Tower of London until he paid a hefty fine. More withdrew from public life for several years after this. He had learned a harsh lesson. Standing against the king's will had consequences. But here's what's crucial. When Henry VIII later brought More into his inner circle decades later, he was elevating a man who had already proven he would speak truth to power, even as a young man. Henry knew this, and that knowledge would become central to the tragedy to come. This chapter answers what shared beliefs brought More and Henry together, and what belief destroyed their friendship. By 1521, Thomas More had become the king's closest advisor. He was knighted that year. He served as master of requests. He was a privy councillor. Henry consulted him on theology, on governance, on the design of law. According to scholarly analyses of their correspondence and courtly records, More and Henry's bond was cemented by their mutual fierce Catholicism and their shared contempt for the Protestant Reformation emerging in Europe. In 1520, Martin Luther published 3 major theological works attacking the Church and papal authority. The Pope asked Henry VIII to respond, and Henry turned to learned advisors, including Thomas More. Henry's response took the form of his book, Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, published in 1521, and More soon became one of the most formidable voices in the print battle against Luther, including in the Responsio ad Lutherum. For Henry's published defense of the sacraments, the Pope rewarded him with the title Defensor Fidei, Defender of the Faith. At this moment, More and Henry stood side by side. They believed the same thing. Papal supremacy was essential to Christian unity. The Pope was the head of the Church. No secular ruler had authority over spiritual matters. But then something happened that changed everything. Henry fell in love. In the late 1520s, Henry became obsessed with Anne Boleyn. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 2 decades, but Catherine had borne him no son, only daughters. Henry became convinced that this was divine punishment. He needed a new wife. He asked the Pope for an annulment. The Pope said no. Here is where the betrayal begins to take shape. The king and his conscience keeper began to want different things. By 1529, More was elevated to the highest office in the land, Lord Chancellor of England, the chief minister of government, the guardian of law and equity. More tried to walk a careful line. According to historical records and letters, More did not openly defy Henry's desire to annul his marriage. More's strategy was silence. He would not argue against it. But he would not support it either. He hoped this middle path would preserve both his loyalty to the king and his loyalty to his faith. It was the most dangerous hope he could have harbored. More believed that a man of principle could serve a king of shifting convictions by simply staying quiet. But he was about to learn that in the eyes of Henry VIII, silence itself was a form of rebellion. This chapter answers, how did Henry VIII transform the law to make it a tool for punishing More's conscience? Let's move forward to 1531. Henry was growing impatient. The Pope would not grant the annulment, so Henry decided to rewrite the rules. In 1531, Henry summoned the English clergy to Westminster and demanded that they acknowledge him as the supreme head of the Church of England. After heated debate, and only after some bishops managed to insert the phrase, "so far as the law of Christ allows," they agreed. The words were a thin theological shield, but they were there. They meant the bishops were trying to preserve papal authority in spiritual matters while grudgingly accepting the king's authority in temporal ones. More watched this happen. He could have signed on, but he didn't. According to scholarly analysis of legal records, More believed that what Henry was doing violated the ancient laws of England, specifically Magna Carta, the great charter that established that even kings were subject to law. More was not wrong. By May 1532, More decided he could no longer serve in this office. He resigned, citing ill health, but everyone knew the real reason. His conscience could not allow him to administer laws that he believed violated both divine law and English law. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like More had found a way out. He would step down, the king would move on, peace would be restored. Instead, Henry's determination to destroy papal authority intensified, and so did his determination to destroy More. In 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in secret. The Pope condemned the marriage, but in England, a new archbishop, Thomas Cranmer, a puppet of Henry's will, declared the marriage valid and Catherine's previous marriage annulled. The tables had turned. The Pope no longer had power in England. Henry needed something else now. He needed proof of absolute loyalty from his subjects. He needed to know who was with him and who was against him, and he needed it in writing. In 1534, Parliament passed two acts that transformed dissent into treason. First, the Act of Succession, which declared Anne Boleyn's children legitimate heirs to the throne. Second, the Act of Supremacy, which explicitly rejected papal authority and established Henry's supremacy over the Church. And then came the Oath of Succession, a requirement that those summoned swear that they accepted the succession settlement and renounced any foreign authority, including the popes, in England. The oath required more than accepting a political line of succession. It required the swearer to repudiate papal authority. According to the indictment records from 1535, now analyzed in scholarly collections, the oath was written with calculated precision. It did not leave room for the theological nuance of so far as the law of Christ allows. It was absolute. Henry sent for More. More was no longer an official of the crown. He was just a private citizen. But he was a famous man, a man whom many looked to for moral guidance. His refusal to take the oath would be noticed. It would embolden others to refuse. Henry offered More a final chance. If he would just sign, if he would just say the words, if he would just accept that the king, not the pope, was the head of the church in England. Thomas More refused. More believed he could refuse the oath and still live in peace. He believed his silence was acceptable. He believed Henry would let an old friend step back into private life. He was about to discover that Henry had already decided what More's silence meant: treason. This chapter answers, how was a man convicted of treason on testimony that everyone in the room knew was false? More was arrested on April 17, 1534. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London. He remained there for over a year, almost 15 months, during which Henry's lawyers and counselors tried repeatedly to break him. They offered him chances to recant, they offered him leniency, they offered him face-saving compromises. More refused all of them. By June 1535, Henry had run out of patience. A trial was set. Before we get to what happened in that courtroom, we need to understand the legal framework. Parliament passed a new Treason Act in November 1534, which became effective in 1535 on February 1. This act made it treasonous to maliciously deprive the king of the dignity, title, or name of his royal estates, including his new title as supreme head of the church. Here's what made More's position so dangerous. More had been arrested in April 1534 for refusing the Oath of Succession, but the crown couldn't execute him for that. It was only misprision of treason, not a capital offense. The new Treason Act changed everything. It didn't just criminalize open denial of the king's supremacy, it made even silence treasonous, if that silence was judged to be malicious. According to legal scholars, malice in this statute didn't mean ill will, it meant deliberate intent. More's strategy of remaining silent to protect his conscience was now, by definition, treason. Every time interrogators asked him after February 1, 1535, whether he accepted Henry as head of the church, and More refused to answer, he was committing a fresh act of treason under the new law. The law was designed to trap him, and it worked. On the 1st of July in 1535, Thomas More stood before a panel of judges that included Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's uncle, and other men whose careers depended on More's conviction. The trial transcript, preserved in the state papers and published by multiple scholars, shows that More was charged with 4 counts. First, violating the Treason Act through malicious silence, that by refusing to take the oath, he was effectively denying the king his supremacy. Second, conspiring with Bishop John Fisher, another prisoner in the Tower, to oppose the king's supremacy. Third, through his silence, violating the king's right to his royal dignity. Fourth, a conversation he had had with Richard Rich. This 4th charge was the one that mattered. This is where the betrayal becomes concrete and personal. Richard Rich was the Solicitor General of England, Henry's lawyer and Thomas Cromwell's close ally. According to testimony that Rich himself gave at trial, he went to More's cell in the Tower on June 12, 1535. His stated purpose was to remove More's books and writing materials. But, according to Rich's testimony at trial, the two men had a conversation. Rich allegedly asked More a hypothetical question. If Parliament passed a law declaring God was not God, would Parliament have the right to do so? More, according to Rich's testimony, replied that Parliament could not do such a thing. Therefore, Parliament could not make Henry supreme head of the Church. This testimony was the entire case against More. Here is what makes this profoundly important. Rich's testimony was universally doubted, and it was doubted not by modern scholars, but by people in the courtroom at that moment. According to the trial record, 2 other men were allegedly present or nearby during this conversation, Richard Southwell and another servant named Palmer. When they were called to testify, both men denied hearing any such conversation. Both said they were present, but heard nothing that Rich described. More's response to Rich's testimony was blistering. According to the trial record, More said, "Can it therefore seem likely to your lordships that I should in so weighty an affair as this, act so unadvisedly as to trust Mr. Rich, a man I had always so mean an opinion of in reference to his truth and honesty, that I should only impart to Mr. Rich the secrets of my conscience in respect to the king's supremacy, the particular secrets, and only point about which I have been so long pressed to explain myself." In other words, I would never trust Richard Rich with such a conversation. I have never trusted him, and the alleged conversation happened in a place where there are witnesses who deny hearing it. More's response included one more devastating line. "Then I pray I may never see God's face if Rich's testimony is true." The jury deliberated for what multiple sources describe as scarcely a quarter of an hour, approximately 15 minutes, before returning with its verdict: guilty. Before we move to what happens next, we need to address one of the most pernicious myths about Thomas More. For centuries, Protestant historians, chief among them John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, published 28 years after More's death, claimed that More had personally tortured heretics while he was Lord Chancellor. They claimed he had chained men to trees in his garden and whipped them. They claimed he had watched as prisoners were racked in the Tower. Modern historians across the board have rejected these claims. According to scholar John Guy of Oxford University, who has spent decades analyzing primary sources, these charges are unsupported by independent proof. Scholar Diarmad MacCulloch of the same institution states that there is no evidence that More was directly involved in torture. Richard Marius, another leading More biographer, writes that the story Foxe told of Bainham's whipping and racking at More's hands is universally doubted today. More himself denied these allegations in his Apology, published in 1533 while he was still alive to defend himself. He admitted that he had imprisoned suspected heretics. He called it their sure keeping, but he absolutely rejected charges of torture. Why does this matter? Because it reveals something crucial about how power works. Once a man has been declared a traitor, the truth becomes irrelevant. If false accusations of torture could be spread after More's death and believed for centuries, why wouldn't false testimony from Richard Rich be accepted in a rigged trial? The Foxe myth shows us that narratives, once established, become history. Facts are secondary. More was convicted on perjured testimony, corroborated by men who had other witnesses saying they heard nothing. The jury took 15 minutes to condemn him, but we haven't yet reached the end. What More said at his own sentencing? After the jury's guilty verdict, More was given one final chance to speak, what the law called discharge of his conscience. According to William Roper's Life of Sir Thomas More, More had remained relatively silent through much of the trial, but now, with condemnation already pronounced, he spoke freely. According to the record, More stood and declared, "No temporal man may be the head of the spirituality." And then, according to multiple accounts, More said something even more provocative. He invoked Magna Carta itself, the great charter that the king had sworn to uphold, the document that established that even monarchs were bound by law. More argued that the Statute of Supremacy itself was contrary to Magna Carta, to church law, and to the laws of England. In other words, the king is not above the law, even the law he has made. This statement was, legally speaking, irrelevant. More had already been convicted, but it was spiritually and historically devastating. More had taken the stand to say that Henry had violated his own fundamental oath, his oath to uphold the law. The judge, hearing this, had no choice but to pronounce the sentence. According to the records, it was the full traitor's death. More should be drawn on a hurdle through the city of London to Tyburn, there to be hanged till he should be half dead. Then he should be cut down alive, his privy parts cut off, his belly ripped, his bowels burnt, his 4 quarters set up over 4 gates of the city, and his head upon London Bridge. But the king, perhaps remembering their old friendship, perhaps simply wanting to be merciful in a way that made Henry look magnanimous, commuted the sentence to simple beheading. Here, finally, is where we see the full architecture of the betrayal. More had been loyal to Henry. He had served him as counselor and friend. He had defended the faith alongside him. But when Henry demanded that More betray his conscience, when the king demanded that More acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the church, More refused, and that refusal was classified as treason. But who was the real traitor? Was it More? More had refused to take an oath that required him to renounce papal authority. By contemporary legal standards in Europe, by the church's own doctrine, More was right to refuse. The Pope was the spiritual head of the church. No earthly king had authority to place himself above the spiritual authority. In being faithful to what he believed was true, More was being disloyal to Henry. Or was it Henry? Henry had rewritten the law to make loyal subjects into traitors. He had transformed a man's refusal to lie into a capital crime. He had invented a new treason, the treason of silence. Most fundamentally, Henry had broken his own oath. As king, he was sworn to uphold the law of England, which included Magna Carta, which protected the freedom of the church. Henry had made the law into a weapon to punish his friend for staying true. This is the deepest betrayal. When a ruler weaponizes the law itself against those who will not bow, why should we care about something that happened in 1535? Why does Thomas More's trial matter to us today, 500 years later? Because More's trial established a precedent that still echoes. When a government redefines loyalty as the abandonment of conscience, when it criminalizes silence, when it bends the law to destroy those who refuse to conform, we are watching the betrayal of law itself. We are watching a contract being broken, the social contract that says even kings are bound by law. The reason More is considered the patron saint of statesmen and politicians, as Pope John Paul II declared in 2000, is not that he was right about the Pope. It's that he was right about something more fundamental. When conscience and law diverge, a person of integrity must choose conscience, and the state that punishes this choice has abandoned its own legitimacy. More's execution did not save the papacy from Henry's power. It did not stop the Reformation. It did not restore the unity of the church. It simply killed a man who refused to lie. But it inspired others. It showed that there was a limit to what power could demand. It demonstrated that some betrayals are worse than others. The betrayal of one's own soul is worse than the betrayal of a king. We should note one more thing, because this is important for understanding how history works. Most people know More's final words as, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." But according to modern scholars and trial records, More actually said he was dying the king's good servant and God's first. Subtle difference, but crucial. The misquote has been popularized by Robert Bolt's 1960 play A Man for All Seasons, which changed "and" to "but," shifting the meaning from loyalty with conditions to outright prioritization of God over king. The actual words are more sophisticated. More was saying, "I remain the king's servant, but God comes first." It's a statement of hierarchy, not rejection. It's profound in its way. A man can serve both king and God, but only if he's honest about which is ultimate. In that distinction lies the real lesson of More's life. Let's recap what we have learned in this episode. Thomas More and Henry VIII began as friends bound by genuine affection and shared intellectual passion. But when Henry demanded that More renounce papal authority and accept the king as head of the church, when Henry, in essence, demanded that More betray his conscience, their friendship could not survive. More was convicted of treason based on testimony from a man everyone knew had perjured himself, testimony contradicted by credible witnesses. The charges themselves violated the principle of law that the king was supposedly defending. The deepest betrayal in this story is not More's betrayal of Henry. It is Henry's betrayal of law itself, his transformation of the law into a weapon against his own conscience and his own people. Thank you for listening to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened. If this story moved you, I'd ask you to follow this podcast and leave a review wherever you listen. It helps others find episodes that matter. This was the last episode of the season, based on our album Betrayed Unbroken. Next season will be based on the album Legends of the Emerald Island, and we'll dive into the myths and legends of Ireland. Until next time, and remember, loyalty to power is a poor substitute for loyalty to truth.